While staying with that conflict, Russia remains adamant that its military operation is not in any way meant to violate Ukraine's sovereignty. Scores of people have been killed in Ukraine and thousands more are attempting to flee the country as the conflict enters its sixth day. For more on the story, we're joined by security analyst Stephen Buchanan-Clarke. Stephen, good evening. Thank you. And thank you for your time tonight. When we look at just some of the latest figures coming out of the United Nations, they're predicting that already 500,000 people have fled out of Ukraine into the neighboring countries. This conflict seems to be escalating. When we look at multilateral institutions like the United Nations, I mean, can the UN broker some form of peace in a situation like this?
Evening, Kathy, and thank you for having me. Yes, I think, as you rightly note, the figures coming out of Ukraine are really disheartening, and I think they'll probably set to rise in the coming days as the Russian columns set to surround Kiev and begin potential artillery bombardments. In terms of your question around the United Nations role in all of this, I think it really is a test in terms of the efficacy of multilateralism in an era where, frankly, the influence of multilaterals has been declining. I think, yesterday the United Nations started a rare emergency special session of 193-member UN General Assembly on the war in Ukraine. This special session is based on a resolution widely known as the Uniting for Peace, which gives the Assembly power to take up matters of international security when the Security Council itself has failed to come to an agreement. So this was triggered last week when Russia vetoed a US-led Security Council resolution that would have condemned Russia's aggression against Ukraine. So this General Assembly is expected to vote on a resolution similar to the one proposed by the US on Friday, namely that's condemning Russia's aggression, reaffirming Ukraine's territorial integrity, and calling an end to hostilities. And this vote will take place tomorrow, and it needs at least 120 states to sign on to it in order to pass. So I think while this if we do get a resolution through the General Assembly condemning the actions of Russia, it's not so much that it's an enforceable resolution. The UN can't enforce peace. But what it is, even though it's non-binding, it is a recognition that extraordinary measures are needed to resolve this conflict, that Russia has violated fundamental principles of the Charter, namely the sovereign equality of all its members and the prohibition of threat of use of force. And really, one would hope it's a sort of renewed commitment to UN multilateralism, to rule of law, to democracy.
Ultimately, because these resolutions are non-binding, there is an expectation that there is some form of moral weight or moral authority that comes out of these resolutions. But in terms of where the situation is right now, Stephen, do you see that being able to sway Russia in any way, especially if we go back to what happened in the Security Council and how the voting over this matter and a clear outright condemnation of Russia's actions, how that voting took place?
Yes, well, as you mentioned, the Security Council was deadlocked when Russia vetoed last week. India abstained from the vote. But ultimately, one would hope that this General Assembly vote does hold a significant symbolic relevance, but also it could be an opportunity for the UN to take a greater engagement on the Ukraine front. If we get a resolution, for example, the Secretary General could call on states to implement sanctions and create a sort of framework for that to take place, a wider amount of states beyond just NATO sanctions. And, there's other things that the UN can do. It could potentially send envoys to scale up humanitarian operations, to act as collect data around potential violation of human rights, and could also provide technical expertise in terms of mediation and negotiations. But ultimately, like I say, the UN can't enforce peace. It really is as a multilateral designed to develop norms and principles. And in many ways, even though this is a fight between Ukraine and Russia, it's much bigger in the sense that it is, I think, a challenge to international peace and security architecture, notions of justice, democracy, rule of law. So in that sense, I think the UN does have a very important role to play in all of this. And one would hope that tomorrow we get a positive resolution, particularly with support from developing countries in the global south, which have often critiqued the UN for being, double standards and for using a perceived interest in human rights, Western countries to interfere in domestic politics. But one would hope this is a sort of reaffirmation of multilateralism.
Stephen, it's interesting when we look at some of the comments that were made, particularly following yesterday's emergency council, because, the ambassador of the Russian Federation said there that they had voted against this particular resolution, because the Security Council had been unable to carry out its primary duty, and that is to maintain peace and security. So very much that there's an expectation that the Security Council would have worked harder to find a constructive solution to this conflict. What would a constructive solution look like if we are to consider what the representative of Russia is saying here, or of the Russian Federation is saying here?
Well, I think what the Russian Federation is clearly that's just political spin. The Russians have taken the position that they intervened in Ukraine to prevent genocide, which would make it a legitimate act of warfare. But in reality, we know that's not the case. Intelligence briefings from the U.S. since October last year have shown military hardware buildup along the borders in Ukraine, along the border with Ukraine and neighboring Belarus, Crimea, in the Donbass. And we know, based on the actions of Russia over the last week, that it has clearly violated the sovereign equality of all of its member states, Article 2 and Article 5. In terms of a constructive role the UN Security Council would have played, Russia's never going to vote against its own self-interests. So I don't see how that vote would have ever turned out any different. And over the last decade, the UN Security Council has become increasingly deadlocked on major peace and security issues. I think precisely because, we're moving from a unipolar world where the US holds the most power with the international system to a much more multipolar world where China, Russia, the US are all contenders. So there's going to be less agreement around these essentially fundamental ideological principles, and increasing deadlock at the UN Security Council level.
Security analyst Stephen Buchanan-Clarke, thanks for your time tonight on News at Prime.